Jesus will appear to his disciples, and some of them will doubt, or they'll all doubt. They'll think it's not really him. Good.
All right, well, let's go ahead and dive in. Dr. Ehrman, welcome back to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have you on. I caught that you're going to be doing this course on the other doubting Thomases, and I said, okay, I got to interview you about this because I have some questions. Specifically, I have noticed passages like Matthew 28:17, where it talks about how the disciples, they saw the resurrected Jesus and they adored him and worshiped him, but then some doubted.
Yeah.
And I know that's kind of the topic of what you're going to be engaging in this upcoming course. And so I said, okay, I got to ask you about this because I've always kind of wondered, what exactly is going on there. So, really excited to talk to you about this. I see that you've been talking about these doubt traditions found in the New Testament. So tell us a little bit about what they are, why you're doing this course, and maybe give us a few examples of these doubt traditions, as you call them.
Well, I, like most people, of course, I read them before, for years and years, and it never quite occurred to me until, I don't know, some years ago, but, not that long ago, that it's a little bit strange that they're so consistently there.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody finds the empty tomb and they can't figure it out. What is this? Did they move the body? Did the disciples steal the body? Why is the tomb empty? So the tomb never ever makes somebody believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. Unlike in modern Christian apologetics, that's always a proof. But in the New Testament, it's never a proof. It always causes doubt. But then the more surprising thing is that Jesus will appear to his disciples, and some of them will doubt, or they'll all doubt. They'll think it's not really him. And you wonder why do you have this so consistently? And the weirdest one is in Acts chapter 1, verse 3, where Jesus spends 40 days after his resurrection with his disciples, proving to them with many proofs that he's been raised, that he's alive. Like, how many proofs do you need for 40 days? He's there. He's talking to them. And so I got really interested in this question of why do you have the doubt traditions? And, I've thought of various reasons for it. And this will be exploring whether they continue to doubt.
And this is kind of the first attempt to do so, to my knowledge. And I think you yourself have mentioned that scholars don't tend to focus on this. If that's the case, why do you think that is? Why do you think nobody else has really focused on this before?
I don't know. I mean, people have been talking about the historical Jesus and the possibilities of the resurrection since the 1770s. And so I'm pretty sure somebody's probably talked about this, but if they have, I don't know about it, or I've forgotten it. More likely I've forgotten it. But it's not like a common theme. And of course, when we move into the Easter season, it's nothing anybody really talks about. And I think it's because we just assume that, all the disciples came to believe in him, whether we think they were right or wrong. And we think that because, the New Testament does come out as well and say, yes, they all believed in him.
Do you have an example of where it notes that they all?
Well, I mean, it doesn't actually say they all believed in him, but the assumption is in Matthew, when Jesus gives the Great Commission to the 11, the assumption is that he's telling them to go make disciples of all the nation. And so the assumption is that they're on board with it. But a lot of places don't.
The wild part is literally one verse prior to that, it says some doubted.
Oh, no, I know. And sometimes when they say doubt, so in Matthew's gospel, when they say some doubted, it's actually interesting when you read it in the Greek, because it's an unusual word that means to stand in two places at once. And the only other time it's used in Matthew's gospel is when Peter is walking on the water and starts looking around and realizes what he's doing, and he starts sinking. And Jesus asks him, why do you doubt? Why do you stand in two places? Why don't you believe? And he clearly doesn't believe because he's sinking, right? So in this, when it says they doubt, it means that they don't really believe. And sometimes instead of saying doubt that way, they actually use the Greek word for do not believe. Why don't you believe?
In the Greek. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So I've actually seen Some say that, well, the Greek should be translated as they, the very ones who had doubted, adored. I don't know enough about biblical Greek to know if that's a
Yeah.
legitimate translation. That actually comes from Orchard's Catholic Commentary. What do you think of that translation? Do you think that that's an implausible way to translate the Greek text?
It's a problematic text because it first says they worshiped him or adored
Mhm,
him, and then it says, but some doubted.
mhm,
And so if it were the other way around, then you'd think they got over their doubt. But
mhm.
the fact of the doubt comes after they worship him. And so I think it's saying some, they may have worshiped him, but some weren't sure what they were doing. I don't know. It's a weird text, but all these are weird texts because why do you have doubt at all? And and there are possible explanations. There are explanations that I've had before that are perfectly in keeping with the traditional views that they all came to believe. But another option that I want to explore is it possible that some of them never did come to believe? They continued to doubt, and the gospel writers knew it. And they're trying
Okay.
to explain from the very beginning. Some of them just didn't believe it.
So you're exploring this as a possibility, but you're still open to the possibility that they later on overcame these doubts.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not a position that you can be dogmatic about either way, in my opinion. When I say either way, I mean, I absolutely can't prove that some of the disciples didn't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, but I can show why it's a real possibility. You also can't prove that they all did come to
Mhm.
believe. People say things like, well, they all died because they believed in the resurrection. They were all martyred for believing this. And we don't know that. We don't have any evidence for that at all. And so you can't prove it one way or the other, but this is a possibility that strikes me as one way to explain why consistently in different accounts and different sources you have this consistent theme.
What would you do with the post-biblical literature, um, some of which would seem to indicate that they persevered in their faith? Would you just say that those are not likely historical in nature?
We don't have accounts of the individual apostles after Jesus' death until the later legendary apocryphal Acts.
Hmm.
Um, we don't have accounts from most of the apostles. We have five. We have five later acts that come from the late second or early third century, that are accounts of Peter, Paul, Andrew, Thomas, and John. And so Paul's not one of the 12. So we have accounts of four of them. One of them does not die for believing in the resurrection, but they all believe in the resurrection. So we have accounts of four of them, but these are highly legendary accounts. Nobody, if people aren't believe me, just read them yourself and tell me whether you think they're legendary.
Yeah.
But you have those four. But other than that, these are late legendary accounts. You don't have historical records. I mean, it's interesting. Even in the Book of Acts, which we call it the Acts of the Apostles, but the first 12 chapters are mainly about Peter, with some bits of John, the son of Zebedee, and that's kind of it. And and then the final 2/3 are about Paul. You don't have any accounts of Bartholomew
Mhm.
or Philip or Andrew, or you don't have these accounts, and even in the New Testament. So to say that we know what happened to them is just not true. We don't know what happened to them.
So where then do you think that this narrative that they did persevere in their faith, or at least end their lives in faith, came from? Do you think it comes from those later acts, traditions, acts of these various apostles, or does it come from something else?
No, it comes from what later church fathers would have said, and what later legendary accounts would have said, and it's based on what you would assume from the New Testament. I mean, you'd assume they all came to believe, and the New Testament itself does say they came. I mean, well, it kind of does assumes that
Mhm.
they came to believe. When Paul says that the Jesus appeared to the 12, I mean, he doesn't say that they came to believe. He doesn't say that. You kind of assume he thinks it. I mean,
Mhm.
but yeah. So I think based on the assumptions found in the text itself, the later legends started springing up, and later church fathers might say something about one or another or all of them. But these are later accounts. In terms of like historical accounts where we actually have information that is historically reliable information about these people, we know nothing. We know nothing
Okay.
about Bartholomew or Philip or Matthew or any of these people.
But now, when you mentioned there the patristic literature, I suppose we're talking about the apostolic fathers here. You're saying that some of them would have attested to the faith of these apostles, believing in the resurrection prior to the legendary accounts being formulated. Is that right?
I I don't think so. The Apostolic Fathers are the earliest group of writers we have from outside the New Testament who hold to the proto-Orthodox point of view.
Hmm.
And I'm trying to think if we. I don't think there are any references in them that refer to all 12 coming to believe.
Hmm.
Um, so you do. The thing is, in the Book of Acts it says they did, and so anybody later is using the Book of Acts, and so they would say so. But you do get accounts, and you get later legendary books that claim to be written by the 12. um, books that like the Apostolic Constitutions is a later book that were allegedly written by these apostles, and so that's all part of the legendary thing. But if you're looking for historical records, like it'd be nice if we had writings by some of these people. We don't have writings by any of them. We don't have anybody later actually giving us a historical description of what, oh yeah, Matthew did this, that, or the other thing, where you could even evaluate whether it's historically right or not. We don't have anything like that.
So why do you think that these resurrection accounts emphasize doubt? Do you think that there's? It sounds like you're saying you maintain there's some kind of historical memory that they're referring to that's embodied, I guess, in this, the gospel literature, where some of the disciples may not have overcome their doubts. Is that kind of the thesis?
My thesis is that that's one of the real possibilities.
Hmm.
I can think of other, and I'll discuss other options. Um, just to give you a hint of one. I mean, it may be that these gospel writers are trying to emphasize that people later may have trouble believing that somebody got raised from the dead, but even the disciples had trouble believing at first. But they doubted at first, but then they came to realize. The funny thing is, and these accounts don't actually then emphasize much that they came to realize. So that's weird. But it might be something like that they're just saying it's okay to doubt because they did, and that makes sense. But you'll see they saw, you'll see.
It's an odd thing, though, to say that, okay, like Matthew, for example, they're supposedly witnessing the resurrected Jesus, spending time with him, eating with him, according to other accounts, um, and then worshiping him. They're confident enough about his identity to worship him, but still doubting. Why do you think that there's still some doubt there, at least from the Gospels perspective, not from this historical memory perspective, but
Oh,
from the person who's actually writing Matthew?
I think it's possibly because they know that Christians in the churches worship Jesus, but some of them just really aren't fully convinced, and wish they were convinced, but aren't really quite convinced. And he's trying to say, this is a natural part of it. We're talking about something that's so amazing and so different from anything we experience that, of course, you have to question it. But in fact, it really did happen, because the gospel writers are absolutely clear. It really did happen. And so I think they're admitting that it's something that's, kind of it's perplexing.
Let's assume for a moment that there is this, kind of historical memory of some of the apostles, not believing in the
Mhm.
resurrection. When you have later attestation, the claims that they did, I guess, for example, in the Apostolic Fathers, wouldn't people have said, wait, hold on, no, that's not true? We have this memory where they doubted and never overcame their doubts. Wouldn't people have come out and said that? And is there any evidence of that?
Well, they might have said it. We don't know. Since we don't have 99.9% of the literature from the ancient world, and since what most people said wasn't in any of the literature, we don't know. We just don't know what people were saying. The thing is that if the critical scholars are right that Mark was our first gospel and was written around the year 70, then by the time Mark was written, probably they were all dead.
Hmm.
And nobody would have known. And the interesting thing is that in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples never do come to believe.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that is, that people don't put enough weight behind that one, but our earliest gospel does not report that they all believed. And so the later Christians, of course, thought they all believed, but they when they report their beliefs, they do it in contradictory ways, which shows that all their accounts can't be
Can
completely
you
right.
give some examples of that? What you would say are some contradictory ways?
Yeah, in these lectures, one of my lectures is going to be devoted to some of these discrepancies. Some are
Mhm,
just tiny discrepancies, some are big discrepancies in the resurrection narratives. But I'll give you one that strikes me as rather important. Luke's gospel is, well, I'll start with Matthew's gospel. In Matthew's gospel, unlike Mark, the women are told, "Go tell the disciples that Jesus will precede you to Galilee. You'll meet him there." The
mhm,
women immediately go off. They tell the disciples go to Galilee. It's 100 miles away.
mhm,
It takes a week or something to walk up there. And so they go, and the disciples go there. They see Jesus, and they some doubt, but some believe. But then he gives them the Great Commission. So,
mhm, mhm,
all right. So, okay. So that's it. So when you get to the Gospel of Luke, which is probably later, Jesus appears to the disciples and he says, "Don't leave Jerusalem." He meets them in Jerusalem on the day of the resurrection. And he says, "Don't leave Jerusalem until the power of the Most High comes upon you." And after he gives them this instruction in chapter 24, he ascends to heaven
mhm,
on the day of his resurrection. Okay. And when you get to the book of Acts, they're still in Jerusalem and they stay there till the day of Pentecost, and they stay 50 days later. They stay there and they don't leave. But wait a second. If Matthew's right that they went to Galilee, how can Luke be right that they stayed in Jerusalem?
mhm.
It literally says they stayed there. And so that doesn't work historically, but it works for each of their accounts because Luke wants to emphasize that the whole thing starts in Jerusalem, and Matthew's emphasizing they went back home to Galilee, and that's where they saw him.
I think I've heard you mention in various lectures and talks that at some point when you were evangelical, you eventually gave up on the idea of inerrancy. You were still evangelical at that point, but you gave up on that. But prior to that, you held to it. What would you have said at that time to try to
Mm.
harmonize those accounts? What was your best steelman argument?
I don't know. I never heard that one. Because the weird thing is when you read Luke, he tells you explicitly that he's raised from the dead, and on that day, and then it's and at that hour, and that evening, and then and that day, and it's all on that day, and then he
Mm,
goes up to heaven. Then in the book of Acts, it says he's around for 40 days, and they're around till Pentecost. And I'm sure, of course, evangelicals have a way of reconciling. What do they say? They have to, however you reconcile that one, you have to contradict one or the other of them,
mm,
because either they did go to Galilee and see him there, or else he's like, you could say he appeared in Galilee and he appeared in Jerusalem both, but then in and maybe you say that he ascended to heaven in Luke 24, but then he came back down and told them they could go now, and then went back up, and they came back down, and maybe you have to do something like that. You have
mhm.
to do something because otherwise they actually do contradict each other.
But I think your argument here would be that, okay, when you start doing that, you get to a point where it's just implausible. Is that
Yeah,
accurate?
you can do it, and if you're driven to do it because there can't be a contradiction, then you just swallow hard and you do it. But if you're just, for me, I got to a point as an evangelical where I just said, I really think that that's pushing it so far that it doesn't make sense. And I
Mhm,
think God gave me a brain to think with. And God is not opposed to me using my reason. And if it's true that it's a contradiction, if it's true, then God knows it's true. And if I want to be on the side of God, I better just admit what's true. And so it wasn't that I was trying to outthink God or anything like that. It's just that, a contradiction is a contradiction. And you can say the square root of 9 is 4, and you can maybe convince yourself that it's true, but it's not true. At some point, you just got to say, this is not true.
So wrapping it up here, when it comes to your thesis that there could be some kind of historical memory that some of the
Yeah.
apostles never overcame their doubts, what would be your best argument against that? Would you just basically say that, well, they did overcome their doubts, but we just don't know for certain. Maybe the Apostolic Fathers are right. Maybe these later legends could be true insofar as not some of the more fanciful things in there, but insofar as they overcame their doubts. What would be your steel man argument to that thesis that you're putting forward here?
I think the biggest argument against it is that the assumption of all the authors of the New Testament is that they all came to believe,
Mm.
and that this is consistently the view, and that if that's consistently the view, then it seems likely. The counter argument, I think that's the best argument, and it's a good argument. It's a very good argument. I think the counter to that argument is that some of the authors actually don't say that at all,
Mm.
and that later writers definitely wanted all the apostles to believe. You're not going to have all of our sources are Christian sources. You're not going to have a Christian source saying that half the disciples actually never believed it.
Mhm.
That's not going to happen.
Mhm.
And so it is a very strong argument that all of our sources either say or imply that they came to believe. But the counter argument's good too, that given our sources, of course they say that. And so it leaves it up in the air, I think, a bit.
So at that point, you would say a person would have to either rely on faith or rely on the authority of tradition or something like that.
I think the authority of tradition, because whether the disciples came to believe or not is not really related to whether it's true that Jesus was raised from the dead. I mean, he was raised from the dead, or he wasn't raised from the dead, no matter what anybody believes about it. And so I don't think it's a matter of faith in the sense that if you believe in the resurrection, you have to believe that everybody agreed. You don't have to. Why not? Why? So, I mean, it happened or it didn't. And so what somebody else believes about is irrelevant, I think, for faith. But if you believe in the Bible, the Bible can't have any mistakes, then of course you're going to say that. But if the Bible can't have any mistakes, you got to deal with these contradictions then. So either way, it's not a cut and dried case, I think.
Fair enough. I'm really looking forward to this course. It's going to be on April 6th. If y'all want to purchase a copy of the course, go to the link in the show notes. There will be a link there, and highly recommend that you go and purchase it. And again, really looking forward to it. Dr. Ehrman, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure. You're always welcome back on.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, the like button, and if you want to support the channel, visit patreon.com/reason